there's a bit of animation that always stood out to me, and I think when you're a cartoonist, you're always going to notice certain drawings and bits of animation, and just for some reason they're always going to stay with you. And one that stuck with me for a really long time was in the original intro of Simpsons, when you see Marge at the store and Maggie's, on the conveyor belt, and she's putting the bag. The way Marge turns and looks at Maggie, and that seems like nothing, why would that stick with me? And it did for a couple reasons, and in a weird way, it points to something that I'm noticing less and less is popping up in animation, and it's a shame, and it's not like it's extinct. If anything, I feel like it can and maybe is making a little bit of a comeback, and I want to put more focus on it. Now, you look at this animation compared to Simpsons, how you usually see them, and it looks very different. The first season of Simpsons, it was a lot more what people would say crude and sloppy. They're a lot more rubber bandish. They're a lot more, absurdist in terms of how they move and even how they're designed. And as the show went on, the style changed. It got a lot more dialogue focused. The humor was more centered on, the social commentary, and not subtle, definitely, but certainly if someone was to get hit with something, you wouldn't want them to have a cartoony reaction where their whole body flies around or anything. It would have to look really solid. Homer getting hit with a baseball has to look like it really hurts, and he has to have a reaction that a normal human being would. You only dial it up a little bit. But I always noticed this animation because I said, wow, Marge would never move like that, at least after the first season. And the animation would change up over time, where they would try to refine it more and more and make it more cleaned up and a little bit more streamlined and stuff like that. Again, just more appropriate for what the style of the show was. And they still kept that intro for years and years. And every time I saw that animation of Marge, I would just notice how all she has to do is turn, see that Maggie's in the bag, and that's it. But the way the hair moves, the way she breathes this sigh of fresh air and relief, it's okay. It just emoted so much. It's not like, oh wow, it's like a groundbreaking emotional moment or anything, but just that animation had so much life to it, and it's only a few seconds, and it's an amount of life in that few seconds that I don't really see much in Simpsons. They went to this very, very standard formula, or as a lot of animators call it, staying on model. And on model means you have a set sheet of expressions and reactions and you stick to that. That is sticking on model. Going off model would be something like if someone had to, shoot his eyes out of his head, reacting to something, getting the mouth really, really big, something like that. That's going off model. You've seen these memes where they say never pause a Disney movie, and they'll either smear something to make it look like they're going faster, or have just one frame where they go really over the top because you kind of notice it subconsciously. That's going off model. But again, it's Disney, so they don't do it much. And Simpsons nowadays, taking the writing out of it, which I hear it's getting better, I hear it's kind of hit and miss, but it's better than where it was before. The animation still looks lifeless to me. They look dead to me. There's something about the way they draw the eyes, and everything is so streamlined, and all the line work is just so smooth, and there's no variation in thickness or anything like that, that they just don't look alive. And this is at the point where it is the most cleaned up, and they're fitting the most jokes in there too. There's jokes in the background, there's jokes in the foreground, there's just jokes all over the place. You look at the new intro and you see that, and that's definitely something that, you can definitely admire, but The Simpsons don't feel alive to me. And I think that is something that is gotten across just in that few seconds with Marge and a lot of the early animation on the show. Not always, again, it can look very sloppy too. I'm not going to praise the first season animation. Some of it's very painful to sit through. I'm not doing that. When you see a character that's designed like The Simpsons, you know you're not going to be in reality. You're going to be in some sort of very strange, exaggerated reality. And again, the style changed over time. There's this YouTuber who made a video on The Simpsons no-nos, and in one of the original openings, they have these people at a bus stop, and they all have the Simpson no-nos, just stuff that now is off-model, and you can't have, mostly because it doesn't allow The Simpsons to stand out more. The thing where, like, their hair connects to their skin, however that works and stuff. That's all in there. But those characters do stand out more and they feel more alive because the line work on them is just so expressive. You feel the energy of the line work as it's being drawn. What I mean by that is if you look at a film like The Tale of Princess Kaguya, which is a Studio Ghibli film, most of it is, on model, again, but there's one moment where she gets really, really angry and she runs out into the woods and the style just completely changes and you can tell what she's feeling just by the line work. They make it a lot more sketchy, a lot more rough, a lot more expressive. The line work suddenly is super, super expressive, and in every frame of that, the lines are different. They're in no way just solid black lines. They're not all the same length. They're not all the same thinness or thickness or anything like that. They are all different. And that scene is so expressive and just leaps out at you even though there's close to no color in that whole segment. That's something that I feel like I'm seeing less and less in shows nowadays, in animation anyway. And you can have animation that's very, not only streamlined, but also very cleaned up and very professional looking. Again, that could be part of the humor, and I think is a part of the humor of a lot of shows. You look at something like Gravity Falls, which can get very silly and very over the top, but it still wants to have humor for adults. So they'll have them look like clearly cartoony characters, but cartoony characters that can just sit down and have a conversation for a bit. It's not something where the animation has to be super, super fluid, but they make up for that by having really expressive backgrounds or really creative characters or really well animated movement in other parts, like in action sequences. But I feel like with the actual expressions of the characters and, like I said, the thickness of the lines, that's not getting across as much in today's animation. I feel like it should. If you ever see some of the Looney Tunes by Bob Clampett, who was one of the earlier Looney Tune artists, his style stands out very, very quickly and is the opposite of something like, say, Chuck Jones. Again, Chuck Jones was much more on model and had this beautiful style to it, again, which just kind of let you hold on the expressions and stuff and was very dialogue-centered. Bob Clampett, exact opposite, just as much slapstick and zany, rubbery, exaggerated humor as possible, and that is what inspired Ren and Stimpy, a lot of that style, where they had this philosophy of never having the same drawing twice. Everything has to be different. If the character is just standing there with like a blank reaction, don't have it look like the drawing we did before of the character with the blank reaction. Have the hand be gigantic, or like, sometimes his hands will even look like cockroach hands or something like that. Just do something that definitely comes from that moment, the emotion of that moment, but just exaggerate, do something different with it. And to me, that's what's amazing about animation, that it can do something like Disney, where it'll look very realistic and very beautiful and just these smooth, soft lines, but then it can be something that's just completely out of reality. Like every frame is something you've never really seen before, can do something that just can't be done in real life. And because we are mostly, thankfully, in a time and place where animation is being seen as both for kids and for adults, I think there is kind of this big move to keep it more so that it's not being confused for something that's just for kids. So when you have characters that look a little bit more, less exaggerated, definitely cartoony, but not as exaggerated as something as, say, like, Ren and Stimpy, that adults can look at that and recognize that, oh, this is going to be a show for me, this is going to have adult humor in it. But now that we've reached this point where adults can say, okay, the animation isn't just kid stuff, now I feel like we can experiment even more and go back to that style that isn't being utilized as much as I feel like it should. This style where every frame is a different type of drawing. And don't get me wrong, in a lot of hand-drawn animation, you have to just hold a character still, definitely. I mean, these don't have, bajillion-dollar budgets. I mean, there are going to be times where you have to cut corners and a character in the background or even the foreground is just going to have to not move for a second. That's fine. You have to work as well as you can with that. but I don't know if the answer is always leaning so far away from this really expressive animation, where nowadays I feel like with adult animation, they're focusing more on the crazy exaggerated backgrounds, which is great. Or if like an action sequence is gonna happen in Rick and Morty, they're gonna make it really, really well planned out. It's gonna be super, super fast. So again, I don't wanna be knocking these shows. I'm saying that there is a style of animation here that is just so expressive and so flowing and has so much more life to it that people often associate with kid stuff, and I see as quite the opposite. I think it's very much getting across a lot more life. And I think we've had enough time of this animation of like, you know, Rick and Morty and Simpsons and stuff like that, where the drawings, the characters are very, very simple. It's very, very simple line work, and it's always the same thinness, the same length of the line work. And we can go back into this adult animation that can really jump out at you with the lines, where if somebody, you know, slaps someone like that, you can have like the lines get thicker as it's going around. That's why you look at someone like Al Hirschfeld, who did these famous caricatures, and there's this incredible thickness and thinness to his lines. And that's because you're looking at these lines and it is almost like following a maze. It's this little journey. When you see a character in a comic book, you know, hit someone or run or something, you do have these lines showing them doing these actions. They're called motion lines. And again, the thicker you have the line, the closer you're gonna think it is, and the thinner it goes, the more it's gonna look like it's going further away. So even just the lines themselves can get across so much without you even realizing it. But I feel like we're leaning more and more in adult animation with just the same type of thinness of the lines. Now, what I brought up before with this kind of return to this style and who's bringing it back, that very much I see in web cartoons, and I see in something that was inspired by a web cartoon, Has Been Hotel on Amazon. Now, this group has done just these big hit shows, and I think what's so great about them is that not only did they catch on online, you know, but it did suddenly go to Prime and A24, and they let them, yes, have it be streamlined a little bit, like animation that you do see when characters are just standing there and talking. There's not much variation in the line work, but not so much that you can't appreciate these amazing moments where the animation just leaps out at you, and there is that thickness of the lines, and there is that incredible motion that's just leaping out at you. In my opinion, you see it a lot more in the show that came out before, Hell of a Boss. It's by the same people. And that is just doing that constantly, where again, I think in Has Been Hotel, they did have to streamline it. They do have a budget, and they need to listen to the studio. They are taking a chance on this show, so they're gonna have to cut corners here and there. And I understand that. I also get that's why other shows like Simpsons and Gravity Falls and Rick and Morty, all that, do that. But I feel like if they're able to experiment with this more and more, and people can see, oh, this is adult, this is made for grown-ups, even though it's drawn in this very exaggerated way, I'm allowed to like this. But on top of that, we also have to compete with CG animation, this style that I'm not a fan of, but I can't totally knock it because there are at least a couple that have done it well, and that's taking CG 3D animation and putting lines on it, trying to make it look like it's hand-drawn. I'm really not a fan of this. To me, CG already kind of feels like puppetry. Don't get me wrong, it is clearly animation, but I feel like it shares more similarities with puppetry than hand-drawn animation does. Where you make this really good model, this, you know, just beautifully crafted model, and then using a computer, you just kind of move it around. That doesn't mean that like there isn't a great artistry to puppetry. There is. To me, though, animation is when you're constantly drawing something new, creating something new every single time. And with CG, if I'm right, with computer animation, you make this model and then you move it like a puppet, which again, great artistry to that, and I don't want to knock CG animation, but I think what people like about hand-drawn animation is that every single drawing is a new drawing, even the one where they had to just stand still while somebody else is talking or something and there's no movement to them at all. Somebody drew that still, and you can look at the line work of it that somebody drew in that moment. I think the fact that there is always a new drawing in every single frame of movement for hand-drawn animation, people feel that, and it feels more alive when they see it. Now, the Spider-Verse movies did that very, very well. They combined and had a lot going on where they did have this respect for the line. They would have it go thick and thin, and they even had, the motion lines in there because they're trying to replicate a comic book. It makes sense. But then you see something like Wish, or even something that's done much better, but it's still a problem with me, this show called Blue Eye Samurai, which again, pretty show, but when I see the lines on there, it's very clear they just took a 3D model and they put these lines that just have the same thinness, the same consistency to it, and it doesn't look like, wow, somebody drew that. Somebody actually just took a pencil, just took the simplest thing you can imagine and just breathed life into something. No, it's this very complicated system, this very complicated machine with very complicated coding and all that made this, and that's fine. Don't lie about what you are. CG animation is just beautiful, and I can't believe how far it's come, but I don't like this idea of just taking a 3D model, lying about what it is, and being like, no, it's hand-drawn. Look. I don't like that. If you're gonna do that, go ahead and really create a style that it makes sense to do, like I said, with Spider-Verse. So what I'm trying to get to is that there is this hint of a resurgence coming back with this style, and while I do see why the other style has been used more, it brings in more adults, think it's gonna be more adult, it's also not cheap, but cheaper to do. It's with a digital animation, computer animation, just, drawing on pads now and stuff like that. This just saves a lot more time. But I feel like this style was starting to get lost and might be making a little bit of a comeback, and I really want to push for that comeback because there's a lot more emoting in that style, in that line work, in the ink work, in all of that going on that I think people are starting to see a little bit, and I think should see even more, and I think this should be explored more. Because when you compare Marge just turning and looking at Maggie in the cart there in the original to the new intro, where it's like 3 frames of her turning her head, and then they have this little nick like that you can tell was just flash animation where they just took that drawing and moved it like that, like they didn't even do a new drawing there, they just moved her head a little bit because you can do that, it's digital. It feels so lifeless. And I feel when you compare these two, you can look at the new Simpsons and all the jokes they're able to squeeze in the background and foreground and all that, but then you look at the original and say, that looks alive. This looks flat and dead. Something that has a lot more technology to it shouldn't look that way. It should be utilizing what has worked in the past and combine it with the technology of today and the future. And I feel like some shows and movies are missing that, but some are starting to bring it back, and I really think we have to put a lot more focus on that. I always say I like that it's reducing it down to its simplest form, a line. You can recognize something is a person or an animal or whatever just through a line. Hell, even a line is just a dot stretched out. You have to put the pencil on the paper and then stretch it out. And I love that. That's amazing to me. And I want to see that respected more in a field where CG animation is used much more, is more cost effective, and is more celebrated because it's seen as more realistic. But I feel like rather than trying to look more realistic, you should feel more realistic. That's my long-winded way of saying that there is a style here that isn't being utilized enough, is starting to get a little bit more recognition, should get more recognition. With that said, I have no idea what I'm going to title this video. I legit don't know. Whatever the title is, it's probably going to be silly and dumb, and it's the last thing I thought of, so if it's terrible, it's literally the last thing I thought of. But yeah, I hope what I'm saying, what I'm trying to get across, it definitely sparks some conversation, at least from animation buffs and people in the field. Let me know what you think. Do you like this style? Do you think it should go the way of the dodo? You think it's just, too cartoony, too zany, and it is called adult animation for a reason, and it's because there's this very distinct style? Or do you think this is something that should really come back and get a lot more attention and should exist just as much as the usual style that we see in adult animation? Let me know what you think. I'll see you next time. Take care.